Question number 3, Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On what date did his Chief of Staff inform him that, quote, there were issues of ministers having to comply, end quote, with regard to the Henry report, and did his Chief of Staff tell him that the minister in question was the Honourable Peter Dunne?
Honourable
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, my Chief of Staff had a brief conversation with me on Wednesday, May the 29th, in which he told me he planned to reiterate on my behalf an expectation that ministers comply with Mr Henry's inquiry. He also told me that there was an issue around Mr Dunne making some emails available to the inquiry.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Why then did he tell the House on the 5th of June that he had no details about the inquiry when the Chief of Staff had been informing him about it a week earlier?
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I had no details of the inquiry. I had a briefing from my Chief of Staff, who of course had also discussions with Mr Dunne's Chief of Staff and was therefore aware of the issue.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Why at that point, having received that briefing on the 29th of May, did the Prime Minister not ask Mr Dunne directly to comply with the inquiry?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I do not consider a conversation held briefly with my Chief of Staff to be a briefing. It was a notification. It was...
Order. Order. Would the Minister please finish his answer?
My Chief of Staff notified me of his intention to reiterate with all ministers that there was an expectation they would comply with the requirements of the inquiry.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
When his Chief of Staff told him that one of his ministers, and named that minister, Peter Dunne, was not complying with an inquiry into the leak of a highly sensitive document, why did he not directly ask Mr Dunne to comply with the inquiry?
Honourable Jerry
Speaker,
Brownlee.
on behalf of the Prime Minister, I was notified that there was an issue around some emails, and I agreed with the Chief of Staff he should reiterate with all ministers that they should comply with the inquiry.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Grant
Isn't it
Robertson.
the case that the reason he didn't ask Mr Dunne to comply with the inquiry is that he does not want the inquiry to find that one of his ministers directly leaked the report?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, no, because the inquiry was underway. There was no point in trying to preempt what a result of the inquiry should be. It was appropriate that all ministers were re-informed that the expectation was they would inquire. It wasn't until the report was made that it was evident Mr Dunne had not complied.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Why, in numerous interviews and in questions in this House, did the Prime Minister not give MPs or members of the public the full story about what he knew about his minister, Peter Dunne, not complying with the inquiry?
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, because it was not evident until the inquiry document was released that there had been a lack of compliance. When I was told by my Chief of Staff, I agree with my Chief of Staff that he should reiterate the expectation all ministers should comply. But that was not known. The non-compliance was not known until the report was released.
Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
How can that answer be correct when his Chief of Staff told him on the 29th of May that Peter Dunne was not complying with the inquiry?
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, it is not reasonable for that member to take the words that I used in saying that there was some issue around the release of emails with Mr Dunne, that meant I knew that he was not releasing emails. Quite untrue.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why is the Prime Minister prepared to put out a report that Sir Bruce Ferguson says was sanitised, that it did not contain all the information that he saw, and further, where the classified information that was highly sensitive was removed out of the original report, then put into the appendices and then never released. Why is the Prime Minister prepared to tolerate that if he's not engaged in a cover-up?
Honourable Jerry
Mr.
Brownlee.
Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, because the report in question was prepared for public release. It did not carry classified information, and neither it should.
Point of order.
Point of order. Right Honourable Winston.
Mr. Speaker, it's very clear that my question refers to the original report that Sir Bruce Ferguson saw, he being the former head of the Government Communications Security Bureau, a man of serious significance in this matter. It's that original report that I'm talking about, and the Minister speaking for the Prime Minister is seeking to duck the question.
Order. No, on this occasion, the Minister answering on behalf of the Prime Minister has addressed the question to my adequately, in my opinion.
Answered it, but it's not adequately. Point of order.
I've called
Point of order.
Point of order.
Mr.
Right
Speaker, again, I raise with you this idea of a subjective judgment where you depart from the standard practice of saying you believe the Minister has answered the question. That may be at variance with other people's views, but we have to tolerate or accept that because you're the Speaker. But when you start putting a subjective judgment on it, like very adequately or adequately, when demonstrably it is not, then you are going to get disorder in this House, and rightly so.
No, the trouble with potential for disorder in the House is the member's persistence in raising points of order when he doesn't get an answer that satisfies the member. My job here is to determine whether the Minister, or in this case the Minister answering on behalf of the Prime Minister, has adequately addressed the question in my opinion. That is my job. I have so ruled. Now, if the member continues to raise points of order questioning a decision that I make, that in itself then leads to disorder in this House. Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Will the Government be holding an investigation into, first, the GCSB morale review leak, second, the GCSB personnel appointment leak, third, the Intelligence Security Committee proceedings leak? If not, why not?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I'm not able to answer that question.
Supplementary question. Grant Robertson.
Did his Chief of Staff have any further conversations with him after the 29th of May and before the 5th of June about progress with the Henry report?
Right, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, depending on the day on which the report was received by the Prime Minister, which was the 5th of June, then the answer would be no.
Question number 4, Denise Roach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Economic